All right. Looks like we got a few people here. Usually it takes a minute for the system to let everybody in. But yeah, I see a hello from Steve. We're here with JD Trask. He's going to be talking to us about finding and fixing bugs in production. And I will interject as I see the need. So some of it will be awful dad jokes, and some of it will be helpful anecdotes from my own experience. So.
Well, if I can help, it'll be all awful dad jokes. So,
Oh, there we go. Anyway, JD, I'm not sure exactly how you wanted to get started. I will just point out that you are the CEO of Raygun. That's at raygun.com, which is a terrific bug tracking system. And yeah, hopefully we can see some magic from that and some magic from some other great tools. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and get rolling, and then yeah, I'll just chime in where I see the need.
yeah, no, thank you very much for hosting this, Charles. I appreciate it. Yeah, so as you mentioned, the co-founder and CEO of Raygun. And so while we do build a tool to help with this stuff, I'm going to be talking a lot today about the workflow and the thinking that's going on in this space. So we'll talk a little bit about how Raygun can help, but it's mostly going to be about that evolution of the space and how developers and ops people can work more effectively to fix issues that are cropping up in production. So I'll be telling some various stories and anecdotes from our experience, as well as what we hear from some of our customers. And that's where I'll probably reach out to you a little bit, Charles, to hear about some of your experiences over the years as well. So without further ado, we'll jump through this. So I'll just click. So starting off with a bit of a story about where we started off. So back in 2004, I graduated from university and joined an IT sort of services company where we built bespoke websites for people. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting at the time was that I got introduced to this idea of hooking into like the global exception handler to send myself an email when something blew up, right? Why has the live stopped? It's a question we've got there. So from Lex, I don't think it has, but maybe it's just Alexa's end. I'll keep going in the meantime. And so what we used to do is we would wire up the global exception handler and send yourself an email with all of the information. So things like the stack trace and other information that might help you fix it. And this was a really useful way of understanding that things were going right and wrong. However, 2004, this was also the time where, you had a 5 megabyte Exchange inbox. So it wasn't uncommon to come in to work on a Monday and be like, oh, all my emails bouncing because there was an error in production and it just filled up my inbox with all these stack traces. And so while it was handy, it was also a bit of a halfway house. And one of the things that I noticed that I thought was really interesting was that about half the developers there would implement such a system. And then about half the other developers were kind of like, if I don't know there are bugs, then there are no bugs. They would rather just keep their head in the sand. And I thought that was kind of a weird way to think, because I always cared about the quality of what we were shipping. And so when we started our business, we didn't actually go into helping people with errors to begin with. We built a bunch of other developer tools, but we started to see the need to track errors ourselves. And we thought, man, we need to do something better than just sending emails, right? Because they're pretty unmanageable, especially at scale. There's just too many emails. And so that led us to building a system that automatically reports the issues into one place and does some smart things like group them up to make them manageable. Because one of the other challenges we used to have with this homegrown sort of system that we'd used previously was if you don't do things like grouping or give yourself sort of life cycle management tools, you start to train yourself not to think about the errors. So a common trait would be send the errors to my inbox. Then it was send the errors to a folder in my inbox so that I'm not missing my important work emails. And then it would slowly become that you forget to check that because most of the errors were noise, not things that you actually wanted to ignore. Most of them were noise, not things you wanted to action. And then suddenly you would miss things like the credit card billing system was failing, but it was only failing once every 1,000 errors. And so you just not notice it. So we wanted to try and solve for that problem. I'm kind of curious, Chuck, if you've had similar experiences in building out things to try and tell yourself when things are broken, or what ways you did, especially that sort of 10 years ago time frame.
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I was pretty new developer.
Yep.
And, yeah, there were systems, I think it was Hot Toad, that's now something else. They've changed the name like twice.
Yep.
But anyway, yeah, it would send emails, and yeah, you'd come in the next morning and all the,
Yep.
it's like, oh yeah, I think my boss emailed me somewhere in the middle of this. I can't tell.
Yep.
And a lot of times stack traces just weren't super handy either. And so, it's like, okay, well now I have to go try and bang on production without breaking anything critical and see if I can figure out what's going on.
Absolutely. And I think, before that was sort of the log file thing where you kind of go,
Yeah.
oh gosh, now I've got to try and get a log file. And then if you go back even further than that, you kind of go, I need a log file off the server, but I'm not allowed to access the server. So I've got to go see someone else who will let me access that log file. And it would just slow things down tremendously.
Or you needed ESP.
Yeah, that's right. One of the interesting things that we found, though, when we actually implemented an automated tool was that in our experience across different products is that you will only ever hear from customers about 1% of the time that they actually have a fault. And that's when you've got a fairly engaged customer set as well. Most people, they've been trained now that software is flaky and breaks. Turning it off and on again might fix it. And so we've kind of ended up in this world where, unfortunately, a lot of people don't appreciate just how bad things are because they don't hear about problems very much. And I can give two anecdotes to that with Raygun. One is, firstly, no one has ever set up Raygun and wondered if it was working because they had no errors coming through. Like literally, we have more than 40,000 developers using this thing, and it's never been a question of like, I don't know if it's working. And the second one is everybody looks at say the pricing tiers and they go, oh, there's no startup. So it's a lot worse than people kind of appreciate. So anyway, we'll jump on in here. So I also wanted to talk a little bit more broadly around the whole developer or DevOps sort of mindset. And this, I believe strongly, is not just about tools. Like I think if you're a really, really large company, there probably is a space for bringing in someone who is your DevOps people who are doing things because it's such a big change. But if you're in a smaller organization, DevOps is more about just sort of engaging your developers to think more about the operations side, but also, and potentially most importantly, being empathetic to the customers, being empathetic to each other. And you see the rise of things like blameless postmortems. I'm just thinking about the customer impact. I'm up here in Seattle, and it's been interesting talking to a lot of people that work at Amazon, where oftentimes when anything goes wrong, one of the key metrics is how many customers were affected. That understanding of the end user is really important. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and a little bit more broadly. The other thing that I find interesting is there's Zuck's famous quote, of move fast and break things. And I kind of think that might have worked pretty well when you're building a PHP website out of your dorm room. But these days, you want to move fast, but you don't want to break things that much, right? And I actually thought it was really telling if you watch the social what's it called, the social network movie, and they even captured that scene where he loses his shit that the website's down because he's like, this creates a negative feedback loop. If it's down, people will move away from it. They don't engage with people, so there's less reason to go back, and it just goes down. We've got to stay up. And I do think that there is an element these days where the mega tech companies, so Google, Facebook, Amazon, they are actually starting to set a bar where you go, actually, this thing is very rarely down, if at all. And they spend hundreds of millions of dollars to try and maintain that. And the interesting thing from the consumer point of view, right, is it's starting to show that there is another way, that things breaking nonstop maybe doesn't have to be how the world of software exists. And so there's a lot of these learnings that we're trying to now bring down into smaller organizations to help them compete at that level as well. So I've got a few points here. One, this is a big one that I'm a fan of, which is when you're implementing any tooling, any systems to try and help yourself better understand issues that are happening in production, I'm a big believer in the rise of actionable insight. So what I mean by that is, if you look back at old things or old ways of doing things, and I'm talking, I've talked with companies that have big Splunk installations, they collect all this data, and they're kind of sitting there looking at these random charts, trying to divine if something is wrong or something's an anomaly and figure out what's happening there. What we really want in today's world is our software to actually reach out to us and say, hey, this thing is wrong. This is what's gone wrong. Here's enough information to you for you to fix it. And then if that's not the case, leave me alone. And I'll give an interesting story that we learned about this with the way that people are using the ray gun product, which is we implemented an NPS system. We wanted to track whether people were happy with the product or not. And if they were not happy, what are the areas we should be focusing our product development on? And we started off where we put a bar in the app, that would say 1 to 10, how likely are you to refer this? Man, people hated that thing. And the reason that they hated it was because the way that we operate is we will ping you when something is wrong. And so you go, oh, shoot, something's broken. Click, look at the data. Oh, okay, this is what's happening. Go and fix it. But because we were actually trying to take them off that cycle of fixing something, it was like, this is the worst time to try and interact on the developer's critical path of trying to fix an issue, to be like, hey, why don't you tell your friends about Raygun? And so that was kind of interesting. We ended up going to an email approach, which originally the reason I put in the app is I was like, man, I hate getting emails, so I don't want to do that. Turns out people actually far prefer the emails because that's more asynchronous, right? Hey, maybe it's a Friday afternoon, I've got nothing to do. So back to the tools. We want the tools not to kind of bog us down. I don't want to have to come in every morning and look at charts and see if something's happened overnight. I just want to be told when something's happened. And I do think a lot of the tooling in the space is going that way now. And I think it's also being helped by the rise of things like machine learning and anomaly detection that's going on. Secondly, there's a big move now to try and make the tools smarter, or at least that's my perception. And I sort of talk about current tools being relatively dumb. And by relatively dumb, I kind of mean, drooling on the sidewalk, and an example of this is at the moment, the current process with a lot of tools for monitoring and tracking your infrastructure or your software is something goes wrong and you go, oh, shoot, we better build a monitor for that so that we can tell ourselves when it's coming next time. And then that way we're safe from that issue in future. And I'll give you an example. We're big fans of Datadog. We use Datadog at Raygun to track our infrastructure. The number of times we've had various servers run out of disk space and then have an issue is, probably not that often, less than 5, but a few times, right? And you kind of go, for such crazy investment in this tool space, how hard would it be to have a default set of rules that say things like, you know what, probably if I'm under 5% of disk space remaining, probably should tell someone about it rather than go, that server basically, crapped out and now we go and build a monitor to track the disk drive space. That's to me, that seems like the lowest hanging fruit. But a lot of the time when we talk about these tools, and this is why I go back to the empathy and understanding of the wider situation, we're not building these common sense things for people to actually understand what's going wrong. And so my view is that we're moving to a world now where we expect to have smarter defaults that are actually going to help us from not blow our feet off by mistake.
Yeah,
Would you agree? Yeah.
I have a little bit of a story there. So I built an app that manages all of the RSS feeds for the podcast. And you talking about disk space. I didn't have any monitoring on that, and it generates a file for the RSS feed every time it updates.
Yep.
And so, of course, I get notices from a whole bunch of people on Twitter going, "Hey, we can't get the podcasts," and the RSS feed thing's giving us an error. So I go and look, and yeah, sure enough, I had made too many files, filled up the file system. And it would have been nice to know that beforehand.
Absolutely. It's don't you think it's kind of sadly amusing that these sorts of problems that, I remember back when I had a 213 megabyte hard drive and I knew what literally every file on that disk was there for, and you're like, okay, managing disk space is not a new problem. This has been a problem forever. And yet our tools don't don't help us by default with those. I mean, and I'm picking on one example. Like I say, we're big fans of Datadog for a lot of other reasons. But yeah, the next one is making these tools get real. So this is where I see things like generalized logging tools where it's like, hey, we just log everything. Hey, that's handy when you really need to dig in and try and do some forensic work. But the important thing is why do we build software? We actually build software for human beings, right? Even if it's something that just runs on a server that does something random like back things up, we're doing that to try and ensure that if there was a software issue, we can restore the software that helps people. Even machine-to-machine stuff, it's always there to be a servant to human beings, right? And so it blows my mind that a lot of these tools, they really are only looking at, and I use the matrix example, at the zeros and ones. They're not saying, yeah, but this affected this woman in the red dress, right? Like, you need to understand the impact on people. And that's hugely important. And so I see that as a blended area where we start going, you know what, we're building this software for real people. Development teams need to stop thinking only about the code and build that understanding of their users and customers. And it's interesting seeing that you'll identify a little bit of a behavior change as well when the developers are more empathetic to the people who are using their software. They'll care more about the quality, but equally they'll often think a little bit differently when wanting to debate features and capabilities and things like that, because they'll be thinking of the user. And a classic case of that, we have a rule in Raygun, right, which is don't make your problem the customer's problem. And by that, I mean, something might be difficult to code or say, oh man, this is going to take me 3 or 4 weeks to build this thing to make it fast. And you go, okay, well, why don't we just ship it as is and it'll be really slow, but it'll still do the job. And you're like, well, wait, so the customer now has to suffer because you don't want to put the time into this? You're actually outsourcing the problem. But if you've built an empathetic sort of culture within your development team, they'd be sort of sitting there asking the same question, like, why would we make the customer experience worse? That sounds like a terrible idea. Maybe I need to talk to my manager about actually ensuring that our customers have a great experience.
Yep.
So part of getting real is also trying to understand that user impact. So I've got this little screenshot here that I took out of Raygun as an example. And this is something that we have baked in from day one, is if you look at this, we're saying, hey, in this demo data, we have 319 known bugs because they're getting grouped up to be manageable. If you're now talking to a product manager or project manager who is trying to build a priority list of what we work on, I would argue that most tools these days are giving you this sort of data with the count. But in reality, by understanding the customer impact by the number of customers that had this issue, you'd say, actually, you know, this one here is obviously far more important to fix than this one here, even though the count is higher. We're frustrating almost 200 more customers than we are with this one, even though it's occurred more, right? And so we want to think less about the zeros and ones and more about the people that are actually in the system. Do you have any comments or thoughts on this stuff, Chuck?
No, not in particular. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and you know, it's sort of this, you know, the death by 1,000 cuts idea, right? That, you know, ultimately you don't want these people to leave, and a lot of these people will leave rather than tell you that there's a problem, and so. I mean, that's what it boils down to for me as far as the business standpoint goes, and as far as anything else goes. I want to write great software, and so, you know, I want people to be happy to use my app. But all of that being said, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're counting up the dollars, you know, more people generally, not always, but generally means more dollars. And so if you're not driving them off by not giving them what they want, then you're much better off. And, you know, you see this with features that people do or don't put into their apps as well. Oh, this just doesn't do the thing that I need. Well, if it's failing to do the job because of something like Elasticsearch timing out or something like that, or some error that it's just a hiccup, it's not behaving as expected, you know, it's the same kind of thing.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that I think it's fascinating talking with so many developers where they often will struggle to actually procure software, for example. Unless it's a $50 sort of tool, they'll kind of go, look, it's just easy to try and find something open source rather than pay for something. The reality is that the software team is not actually a cost center. It can be a profit center. If you consider, like you just said there, more people is more money for the business. It's better goodwill in the market.
Mm-hmm.
The marketing team is spending money to drive people to use your software, so the cost to acquire customers will go down if you can actually convert more of them by not alienating them with poor software quality, whether it's slow or buggy, things like that. And so you actually end up where there's a very strong revenue driver off these DevOps tools to make sure that, hey, if we're investing $10 million a year into our software team, and we're turning that into, let's say, $10 million worth of revenue a year as well, wouldn't it be great if we were turning it into $15 million worth of revenue, and all we've got to do is invest in a couple of tools here? But frequently, the development teams are not the best at actually communicating in terms of business value up the chain. They struggle to articulate that. And that's actually one of the things we've interestingly found quite handy with this, is not only building that empathy for, I don't want to impact a customer, but hey, I can now go to a manager and say, look, we've had 813 customers experience this. And to management, that starts to sound like, whoa, holy cow, how is that being allowed to keep going? So getting real is important. The next thing that I wanted to touch on as well is that a lot of the older tools, they will sample data in a pretty big way, even if you're a small user. And I threw this one in here because I believe that sampling data is a bad idea in today's world. Unless you are truly operating at such a scale that a sampled set is actually going to work for you, which I would argue that most people don't know what that scale actually is to know whether the sampling even makes sense. You just don't want to do it. And cases where we've seen this is we've had one customer, they built an e-commerce site, and they were using a product, quite a dated type of product, to track their problems. And it was sampling the data, and they migrated to us. And the reason they did that was because we don't sample anything. We just try and collect everything we possibly can because storage is relatively cheap these days. And what they identified was that because they were sampling previously, they didn't realize that the 10 servers they had allocated to their checkout process, one server in particular had a bad build on it. And so 10% of all of their purchase processes were failing. But because they were using a tool that was sampling everything, they weren't getting the full picture of all of the servers that were actually in the mix, that were having, that what was working and what wasn't. And so it was costing them an absolute fortune by having the sample data. They were not at a scale where they need to be sampling yet. You know, they're not a Facebook or a Google or anything like that. So I would argue check if your monitoring and ops tools are doing sampling, and ensure that they're not, or at least if they are, they're doing it at a level that's giving you enough picture. And then lastly, actually not lastly, but the penultimate one here is it's important with these tools that you're looking to try and debug and resolve issues in your production environment, that you get both worlds, which is what I call a 30,000 foot view. So I want to see overall trends still. I want to be able to put these up on the wall. But when it comes to actually fixing something, I really need to get down and dirty in the bowels of the code. I want the stack traces. I want all of the environment variables. I want the HTTP headers that were involved. If I don't have that as a developer, I can spend a whole lot of time trying to reproduce errors and recreate the problem. And so I find a lot of the products out in the market these days are either a 30,000 foot view, or they're subatomic level, and they struggle often to actually meet and provide both. So it's important to make sure whatever you're choosing, and I want to be clear here, I'm not trying to make this into a spiel for Raygun, because this applies across all sorts of different tool sets that we don't even provide. It's just important to think about. So even if you're using a logging tool, what can I do with the high level trends and dashboards versus what can I do when I want to go down to the individual line items? Cool. And then lastly, a trend that I think is really important for helping build this culture of quality amongst your wider engineering team is setting up information radiators. And so by that, I mean putting up dashboards around the office, making sure the tools you have are pumping their data into a dashboarding tool or have a dashboarding capability built in. And that'll help also build this environment-wide appreciation for the quality of what's going on. And that should, assuming that you maybe have a relatively, maybe a smaller company where there's non-devs on the floor, you can have somebody might come out of marketing and be like, hey, what is going on over here? What's happening here? And it just kind of creates the shared mission around quality and making sure that the customer experience is going really well. And nobody has an excuse for saying, oh, I didn't see this, or I set up an inbox rule, or I'm not in that Slack channel for those alerts. They're just around you all the time. It also helps create this culture where talking about quality is it's not a risky business. There's a lot of times where, especially junior developers, hands up if you've dropped a production database, by mistake, that sort of thing, where we are sometimes, we actually are trained early on to be fearful of the mistakes, and creating a culture where actually we kind of know we're always going to screw up, and our ability to identify it quickly, resolve it quickly, and roll forward means that we hopefully lessen that fear of failure, because we're always going to fail, right? We're human, and we're humans running computers that can accelerate our failures at a great rate. So it's important to try and diminish that sort of fear. Is there anything, any anecdotes or stories you have on that one, Chuck?
Nope. I mean, the only thing that I've done that's worse than drop the production database is corrupt the data in it. Thankfully, we had a backup, but still, I mean,
yeah,
it's crazy how quickly you can mess stuff up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I can't count the number. It's one of those things actually which I overall don't enjoy the fact that I'm no longer like writing code on the product. But those sorts of experience, I'm like, well, I can't screw it up if I don't touch it. So someone else's fault now. But yeah, cool. So with that, I wanted to sort of just jump through, and we'll use Raygun because we actually monitor most of Raygun with the Raygun product, unsurprisingly. And I just wanted to show you sort of our workflow. So I'm just going to jump out of the presentation here. Oh, let's minimize that guy. So this is just using demo data. So anything you see in here is none of our customer data. We take privacy and all that pretty seriously. So this is not actual problems we have. But I just want to walk through the workflow. So you can see here, we're looking at an application called website. And so one of the things we want to do is also be able to track everything in here. So whether it's the front end of the website, back end of the website, one part's written in Node, one part's written in .NET, another part Java, it's all in here, right? So we want to have a single place where we can see the entirety of our system. And so within this app, we can see this error rate over time. And then down here, we've got this inbox of issues. So because we do automatic fingerprinting and roll-up, we could take these issues here, of which there's about 1,200 errors that have occurred, and we make it into 5 bugs. So again, that's a huge way of making it much more manageable when you have an absolutely huge number of errors. And so an example of this is Raygun's running on websites like dominoes.com, where you can imagine that those guys, if they have an issue, they have a lot of issues. The roll-up makes that a lot more manageable for them to work on. This is a small example with 5. And so the way that we would operate is we integrate with a whole lot of different tools, and we tend to pump the notifications directly into Slack typically, right? So there's an ops team channel which has everybody, pretty much our whole dev team is in there, that will see when Raygun errors are occurring, and they'll tell them. We don't say there's something every time there's an error. We do it on a per group basis and on thresholds and rates. So, hey, this is still happening and it's speeding up. That's terrifying. And that allows the team to jump through. They can even assign the issues to themselves directly from within Slack and so forth. But let's say we want to jump into one of these. Let's say we want to go into this one. We're going to look into the argument null exception, which is actually preloaded here. And so I come in here, and as a developer, this is kind of going, hey, well, I went from an application level view where I could see the overall trend of errors down to, okay, now I'm an engineer and I've got all of these instances that I can page through. So if you didn't like yourself very much or you're trying to identify trends, you can actually page through all of these because it's non-sampled. And I can look at the stack traces here and I can try and figure out what's going on. And you can see here, as part of that empathy building, I can also see who the user was. So I've chosen to identify the customer in here. With our tooling, we don't do anything with that data, so it's all private. There's no major concerns with providing that. And I can go through and look at all of these details. So the summary tab's just the stuff that that I particularly like to see. But I can go through and actually look at HTTP variables, environment variables at the time. And quite importantly, with the way that this works is we can augment the data. So when something goes wrong, we want to try and collect as much diagnostic information as we can. And that can often include bits of data that we can't automatically capture, right? So that's where we might want to do things like tag it, or we might even want to attach custom data to give ourselves more information so that we can diagnose this more quickly. And one thing that's quite cool is that we also have a real user monitoring product. And what that does is that's tracking what the customers are doing with the system. So we can see if we wanted to recreate this error here, this user was running on a Mac machine, running Chrome on a desktop, and we can actually see their whole navigation flow here, overlaid the performance that they were experiencing. So how much of their time do they spend waiting versus where first using the system, and then we can see it overlaid with the crash details. So I can, if I need to try and recreate steps and understand what's going on, I would kind of go, all right, well, first thing I need to know is that this was Chrome on a Mac. Maybe I'm using Firefox on Windows and I can't recreate the issue, that sort of thing. So we're driving people that way. Once an issue gets resolved, if we jump back here, I'll give you an example. We track the deployments. So I'll jump out to the 6-month period. And I'm going to show you the reverse here of, like we can see there's a big jump in our error rate that occurred here around July. Now, if I go in and grab this time frame and I filter this down, you can see these are the errors that occurred in this time window. But I can see here that I've actually done a deployment around this point. So something went into production that rocketed up the rate of errors. And so if I open that, which I'll open in a new tab, close that guy there, we can go through and actually look at this deployment and go, oh, well, look at this guy. Clearly, we've pushed something out here, and this would, if I click on this, it will just take me straight through to the that error group page with all of the diagnostic details about this. We can jump in and actually see, if it'll load, the information about it. It'll be basically the same as what we went into in there. And so that starts overlaying deployments with the quality, with the details for the engineers to be able to fix it. And then from the outside here, let's say I fixed this error. We'll just grab one of these. We change it into a resolved state. Okay, so once it's resolved, it goes out of this list and into that bucket. And what will happen is if it regresses, we'll actually send a notification as well to say, hey, this issue regressed. Okay, so it won't just say it's a new error. We know the whole history, and you can put comments on there and see what people have done historically so that you're building this sort of book of understanding about this bug over time. So that's one way of doing it. There's also, in situations where you're doing, say, partial rollouts, or you've got mobile apps where you don't control the rate of rollout, you can also do things like resolve in the version. So if we fix it in version 2, but we're still seeing errors come in from version 1, don't unresolve it and bring it back and say it regressed. So that's kind of the common way we do things. And so when the team we probably deploy software 10, 20 times a day, right? And so people are watching that channel in Slack, and it'll start to go off if something new appears. It'll be really obvious who's been engaged with that piece of work. They can jump in, they can see this, they can very quickly understand what happened. They can usually what we call fail forward, which is rather than revert a build, it's usually faster just to fix the issue and move forward. Because it saves a lot of time that way. So that's kind of the very, very high level way in which our workflow works for new bugs that are flowing in. The other thing that we try to do is if there's an issue of significance, and we're talking about maybe something that you're going to run a post-mortem on, it affected a lot of customers, it was really obvious, that sort of thing. That's where you can actually jump in or jump in here and see the users that actually had this issue. And so this is a great way. You can see these are the users that were affected by this particular bug, and I can actually export that out, and we could give that to our customer success team to contact those customers and say, hey, we're really sorry about this issue. Maybe we've credited you $10 or whatever. We've had customers who have used this feature, for example, to resolve issues without needing to talk to customers. So one of our customers was implementing Apple Pay for a website, right? And the customer was told the billing was successful, and it was, but they actually had a bug that meant that it didn't apply the payment at the back end to enable the product that paid for. And it was like, oh, cripes, Now, without this sort of product giving you that sort of detail about the customers, they would have to go to those, figure out who those customers were the hard way by actually going, oh, okay, we need to maybe dredge some logs, see who was logged in. This allowed them to just export this list and provide it to their support team, who then manually went through their admin system and just applied the product unlocks, and away they went. So the customers were none the wiser that there'd actually been this issue. So again, understanding those customers is a really key part of how we operate, and an important way of sort of as well keeping track of VIP users, perhaps. So we have some customers that run gambling websites. And if you understand anything about the gambling industry, there's usually a few whales that make up the bulk of their revenue, and then everybody else. And so making sure that those customers have a great time is a top priority for them. So this is where intermingling that machine data, stack traces, error logs, all of that, with the customer information helps us create a much better experience. And beyond the crash reporting, so that's done through an SDK, it's always important as well to consider performance. So performance is absolutely a feature, and software that is slow or doesn't work will always alienate users, make them frustrated and leave. And so we also track that with the real user monitoring in here to sort of say, where is the time going within our app? What is the experience the user's having? So that's a really important point as well. I feel like I've been talking for a really long time, Chuck, so I'm going to sub you in for a second.
Right. I don't really have a whole lot to add. I mean, the thing that really gets to me more than anything else is just you give information about the users that are being impacted. You're going back to who's being impacted, who are the people, and then being able to take care of them. And so you can do those things the right way. One other thing, you're talking about performance, and I've seen a number of studies that show, especially on mobile phones. So if I'm sitting at my computer and I punch in yourwebsite.com,
yep.
If it takes a little bit longer to load, that's not as big a deal as on the phone, right? A lot of studies have been done are showing that you're getting less and less time on the phone. So if you don't come up quick enough, they're going to forget about you or leave or whatever. And I've actually done this too, right? I get on my phone and I'll be browsing to something and it takes a while to load. And so I'll switch over and I'll play some game somewhere on my phone. And then I'll come back to it the next day and I'll be like, oh yeah, I was trying to look that up. Never mind. And so it's an impact, and you don't see it come up as a bug because, everything actually worked right. It just didn't work fast enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one, there's this big frustration in the community at the moment about Google's AMP pages, right? And it's like, well, Google's kind of acknowledging the fact that actually a lot of people don't build good performing websites. And that does frustrate users. And so they're trying to build that out, which I somewhat commend. But at the flip side, it's like, hey, we don't want Google controlling this walled garden, which I totally understand as well. But it's kind of like, well, maybe make your website not suck. That's kind of your solution here, right? They know that if sites are faster, especially if they're using their products, they're going to make more money. And so they're actually almost going, fine, if you don't want to do your own DevOps, we'll roll up our own friggin' sleeves and solve it for you. So yeah. And that's the other thing as well, just touching on it briefly, is there's a lot of antiquated tools out there that will only ever talk about averages as well. And averages are lies. So here you can see we're reporting across this website. And by the way, this supports native mobile apps, iOS, Xamarin, Android, all that stuff. But you can see here we've got an average load time of 1.82 seconds. the median or the 50% point is 1.25. And then the last, basically 90% of our users are experiencing 3.08 or less. But at the P99 point, so 99% of our users are experiencing less than 6.3. But the users at the 99% point are getting 6-second load times, which is pretty bad. Again, keep in mind, this is dummy data in here, but yeah, and the way the story I always like when talking to folks about why averages are lies is you go and fill up the local stadium with homeless people, right? And then you bring Bill Gates in there, and on average, everyone's a millionaire, right? And that's the problem. And I see this a lot with tools like New Relic, right? Everything's a friggin' average. And you're like, well, that doesn't tell me anything. That's my stadium full of millionaires right there. It's useless. And so we believe really strongly, especially with the compute power that you have these days that's available and the storage costs and all of that. Yes, it's a bit of hard work, but actually giving people that distribution, medians, P90s, P99s, that sort of stuff, really, really important. Cool. So that's just a quick run through of some of the ways we do things. Like I say, Slack seems to be, or HipChat, or whatever, Atlassian's building their new chat thing, or whatever you're using internally for chat, that seems to be much, much better to use. Do you mind sharing the URL, the dashboard that you're sharing? Well, this dashboard is private within Raygun. You can just sign up for a trial and pump the data in yourself. There's a free trial. There's also other dashboards in here, like this is the information radiator one. So you can create multiple dashboards in here to sort of build these out. So we could, add different tiles for things that we want to do in here. We have a TV mode. You can drag and drop and move these things around. You can configure anything you want, like, hey, maybe I want to report across multiple different apps, things like that. So we released this earlier this year, and we've got a major new revision to that coming shortly. So Matt and I strongly suggest just grabbing a free trial and seeing how you like it. So that's our kind of workflow at a pretty high level. The reason I was talking about the chat tools is Slack for us now is our number one integration, right? And we find actually when we first built Raygun, a lot of it was email based to send you notifications, and it's been phenomenal watching how many people turn all of those off and then go and just enable the chat stuff. And the great thing about chat is within the team, again, you're trying to build this culture where it's not, you're not afraid of breaking things, and you can have conversations, and maybe other team members in different locales see things and can pick it up. And you're also capturing a good history in there around the conversations that were had related to an issue. So that's a big one for us and changed how we work. I'm just going to this up. This thing always goes around the wrong way. So lastly today, I wanted to talk a little bit about where is the DevOps sort of space and tooling and monitoring going. Now, I could talk for days on this. If you can't tell already, I quite like to talk. So I've just compacted it down to one of the main trends that we're seeing and that we're trying to drive ourselves. So firstly, getting that full stack context. So better understanding of cause and effect. And by that, I mean wanting to build a fuller picture. So today we talked about trying to identify and triage and deal with errors in production. We've talked about that at the application layer. We've talked about tools like mentioning Datadog for infrastructure monitoring. And we've talked a little bit about real user monitoring because we do that as well. And what we're seeing with our customers is this move where actually I believe there's going to be significant consolidation in this category over the next 5 to 10 years, because at the moment we have a lot of individual products and tools that don't really talk to each other very well. So when we started out, we were doing an error reporting, crash reporting product. We then expanded into real user monitoring. We have a third piece that we're internally calling Project Proton that we're hoping to launch soon. But bringing that data together is so important because where these things overlap is actually where you get the unique insight and fuller picture, right? So not putting these things into silos. And you can see even today, there's this move towards trying to build platforms in this space. And if you look at things, and sorry, I'm kind of pick on New Relic again a little bit here, but it's like you've got these individual products, but they actually very rarely will ever actually share data to bring you a fuller picture. And in their case, they'll just say, we'll pump it all into New Relic Insights and pay us to store it twice, which is kind of a bad move. I believe fundamentally that we should be building these products from the ground up so they have a data lake of everything that we can possibly track around run, errors, APM, logging, alerting, all of this, and allow you as the DevOps engineers that we all are to actually say, I want to see what happened here and build me a full picture about what's going on. Did this error impact the customer performance? Did the server infrastructure issue lead to this error occurring? So maybe the error occurred because there was an S3 outage, that sort of thing. At the moment, there's a lot of specialized tools, very little integration. And so I think that's going to be the fundamental change over the coming years that really brings, to be honest, a fair bit of a revolution to this space. What do you think the big trends might be here, Chuck?
I think you're right. And I think you're right for, there are a couple of reasons that I'm seeing here. One is just you're talking about having these different systems, and getting the insights where they overlap is important. But I think the other thing that is happening, and you've talked about DevOps a lot, and DevOps to me is as much about the communication between teams or different systems or people that manage different areas of your application as it is about actually managing infrastructure.
Yep.
And that communication that this is going to foster but within a company, I think is also going to become critically important. And so I think partially it's having a solution that can tell you, this kind of server performance also impacted this, real user performance and caused these errors and things like that. But I think also it's going to facilitate a lot of these conversations that are going to take us to the next level of application development. And it's going to change the way we think about a lot of this stuff. And it's all going to boil down to facilitating the kind of personal interactions, not just system interactions, that are going to open a lot of those doors.
I 100% agree with you there. And you're right. It's about taking it wider. We have people now that are putting the system through to their support team because they can watch user activity live. So if they're working with a customer on the phone, they can actually see what they're doing in their software as they go. They don't have to say, click on the button. What do you see? They can go, click on the button. Oh, I can see that you're now on this page. Cool. Next steps, that sort of stuff. And that's also an important thing with these tools is making sure that they aren't just built for the engineering people. We're all nerds. We can all parse that data. A lot of people can't. And so making sure that they can digest the information in a way that's friendly to them is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So that's one of my big last ones, and so that kind of brings me a little bit to the end of running through a little bit about how we think about trying to monitor errors and improve production, as well as the DevOps story in there and where this industry and market's going. So I guess I'd just like to open up if there are any questions, or even if you have any questions for me, Chuck, or maybe I have some questions.
No,
for you.
I know everything.
I was going to say, you've kind of let me down on the dad jokes here. I was looking forward to some, but yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. So yeah, it's I'll leave it at that. Christopher wants to know, when will we hear an official announcement about Proton? At the moment, we are approaching the point where we will be running a internal, private beta with some of our existing customers, and rolling that out to a select few to begin with, and then going a little bit wider with it. I would expect a full market sort of announcement coming probably in Q1 2018. Sorry, I can't be more precise. But feel free to, if you're not already, becoming a customer and maybe getting on the early list. As an aside, the reason it's called Proton was the real user monitoring part was called Neutron. So we're going to start having to go to like the subatomic particles pretty soon. So quasars and quarks. But yep, cool. All right. Well, I think that's probably the main question. We did sort of hit on things as we were going through there. So thank you everybody for coming along. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. If you want to follow me or Raygun itself, we're both on Twitter. That's my usual way of engagement. But you can also email me at jdtrask@raygun.com if you have any questions. So yeah, do shoot out. Cool.
All right, cool. Well, thank you, JD. This was really interesting, and I love what a lot of these tools will do for you, and I think everybody should have one. So
you and I are in wild agreement on that one.
Yeah.
No, it's cool. Thank you very much for hosting, Chuck. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yep, I'm going to go ahead and hit the big red button. Thanks everybody. I'm going to try and set up a few more of these just coming up on various topics. So if there's something you want to learn more about, maybe something that's a little more visual than what you can get on the podcast, and let me know. But yeah, thanks again, JD.
Cheers.